The name itself is a ghost story, a name whispered in the dark, born from a city's nightmare, Jack the Ripper. In the autumn of 1888, the British Empire was at the height of its power, a world of science, industry, and rigid Victorian morality. But beneath this gilded surface, in the sprawling, gas-lit labyrinth of London's East End, something ancient and savage was stirring. In the impoverished district of Whitechapel, a place of profound darkness and forgotten souls, a phantom began to walk the streets. He moved without a face and killed without mercy, leaving behind a trail of butchered bodies and a city paralyzed by fear. Scotland Yard assigned its best detective, Chief Inspector Frederick Abberline, a man who believed in evidence and logic. But the killer he hunted was no ordinary man. This isn't just the story of the murders. It's the story of the hunt, and of how a man of reason confronted an evil that defied all explanation. To understand the monster, you must first understand the cage. In 1888, London was the heart of the world, the magnificent beating core of the largest empire the planet had ever known. It was a city of impossible wealth, of grand stone monuments, of gaslit avenues that glittered like constellations on the earth. Along the Thames, the masts of 1,000 ships formed a dense, skeletal forest, a testament to a commerce that touched every corner of the globe. This was the London of polite society, of top hats and carriages, of Queen Victoria and the illusion of unshakable order. But every great city has its shadow, a dark reflection where its secrets and its sins are hidden away. And in London, that shadow stretched eastward. To journey from the grand boulevards of the West End into the district of Whitechapel was to travel to another country entirely. It was a descent. The streets grew narrower, the buildings more stooped and crowded, the very air changing its taste and texture. Here, the triumphant light of the empire did not reach. It was swallowed by a perpetual twilight, a grimy haze that clung to the bricks and stones like a shroud. This was the domain of the London fog, the infamous pea souper. It was no gentle mist. It was a thick, yellow-brown concoction of sea fog from the estuary, mixed with the smoke from 1,000,000 coal-burning chimneys. It was a tangible presence in the air, a choking, blinding miasma that smelled of sulfur and soot. It muffled sound, turning a distant scream into a vague whimper, a cry for help into just another cough in the gloom. It distorted vision, transforming familiar shapes into menacing spectres. This fog was the accomplice of every dark deed, a suffocating blanket that offered perfect anonymity to anyone who wished to move unseen. To walk the streets of Whitechapel was to be assaulted by a symphony of desperation. The main thoroughfares, like Whitechapel High Street and Commercial Street, were rivers of humanity, choked with a constant, jostling crowd. The faces that passed were a portrait of the city's underclass, dock workers with calloused hands and weary eyes, factory girls pale with exhaustion, Irish and Jewish immigrants fleeing persecution, their languages a strange new music in the English din. And everywhere there were children, their faces smudged with grime, their bare feet navigating the treacherous cobblestones with a grim expertise. The architecture itself was a testament to decay. Towering tenements, black with soot, leaned against one another as if for support, their countless windows like hollow eyes staring into the street. Every corner seemed to host a gin palace, its doors swinging open to spill a fleeting chaotic warmth and the sound of drunken singing into the cold air. Butcher shops displayed their wares openly, the faint sweet smell of blood mingling with the ever-present stench of rot from the gutters. And looming over it all were the workhouses, grim brick fortresses where the destitute were sent to labor in exchange for a bed and a crust of bread. A fate considered by many to be worse than death itself. When night fell, the district was transformed. Gas lamps, stationed far apart, did little to pierce the oppressive darkness. They created small, isolated pools of sickly yellow light, islands of fragile safety in a vast black ocean. The spaces between the lamps were where the true life of Whitechapel thrived. In these deep shadows, deals were struck, bodies were sold, and violence was a common currency. The gaslight didn't illuminate the streets. It curated the darkness, making the shadows deeper, more absolute, and infinitely more menacing. But it was the smell that was most overwhelming. The air was a thick, layered tapestry of odors, each one telling a story of poverty. There was the sour stench of unwashed bodies crammed into lodging houses, the sweet, cloying smell of cheap gin and stale beer from the pubs, and the ever-present sharpness of coal smoke. The streets themselves smelled of horse manure and rotting garbage, of fish from the market stalls, and the metallic tang of blood from the nearby slaughterhouses and tanneries that lined the river. It was a smell of decay, of a place and a people being slowly ground down by the relentless machinery of the city. And beneath the cacophony of the main streets lay a deeper, more terrifying world. The labyrinth of the rookeries. These were the unlit, unmapped, and unnamed alleyways and courtyards that existed behind the main facades. To step into a rookery was to enter a maze from which you might never emerge. The alleys were so narrow that a person could touch both walls at once, slick with a damp, foul-smelling ooze. They twisted and turned without logic, ending abruptly in brick walls or opening into hidden courtyards where the London fog seemed to pool and thicken, deadening all sound. This was a world without light, without air, without sanitation. Here, in the absolute darkness, hidden from the sight of any passing constable, was where the killer would find his hunting ground. The rookeries were the veins of Whitechapel, and they pumped not blood, but a steady, cold current of fear. Inside the tenements and flop houses, the conditions were even worse. Entire families lived in a single, small room, often without furniture, sleeping on piles of dirty straw. In the common lodging houses, dozens of men, women, and children would sleep crammed together on the floor or on rough wooden bunks. The only price of admission, a few pennies. There was no privacy, no safety, no quiet. Life was a public performance of misery, a constant, grinding struggle for the barest of necessities. This, then, was the world that awaited its monster. It was not just a poor district. It was a wound on the face of the world's greatest city. It was a place of shadows and secrets, a labyrinth where life was cheap and a person could disappear without a trace. It was a place where history was not sleeping, but was trapped in a waking nightmare, a place that could not only create a phantom like Jack the Ripper, but could swallow him whole, keeping his secrets in its dark and silent heart forever. The darkness of Whitechapel was more than just an absence of light. It was a physical and social architecture that created the perfect hunting ground. A predator does not hunt in an open field. They hunt in a place of cover and shadow, a place where the terrain itself offers an advantage. For the man who would become Jack the Ripper, the district of Whitechapel was the most advantageous terrain imaginable. He did not need to be a phantom with supernatural abilities. He simply had to understand and exploit the darkness that was already there. The first and most crucial element was the district's physical layout. Whitechapel was a labyrinth in the truest sense of the word. Behind the main, gaslit thoroughfares of Commercial Street and Whitechapel Road was a tangled, almost unmappable web of back alleys, courts, and passages. These were the rookeries, a term that perfectly captures the sense of a dark, teeming, and chaotic warren. These passages were not designed with any logic. They were the chaotic result of centuries of unplanned construction, narrow channels carved between leaning tenements and windowless workshops. An alley might twist suddenly into a dead end, or open into a pitch-black courtyard that served as a communal dump for a dozen surrounding buildings. These spaces were intensely private, yet utterly lawless. They were not patrolled. The feeble glow of the gas lamps on the main roads could not penetrate this inner darkness. A constable walking his beat on the high street could be mere feet away from a crime being committed in one of these passages, and he would see and hear nothing. This network of darkness provided the killer with an infinite number of options. A place to find a victim, a place to commit the crime in absolute seclusion, and a dozen different escape routes. He could strike and then simply melt back into the shadows, swallowed by a city that seemed designed to hide him. For the residents, this meant that true danger was never more than a few steps away. To turn off a main road into one of these passages was to step off the edge of the known world. Just as the city's physical structure provided cover, its social structure provided the killer with perfect camouflage: anonymity. Whitechapel was one of the most densely populated places on the planet, a seething mass of humanity packed into a few square miles. But this was not the close-knit community of a small village. It was a place of strangers, a transient population in constant flux. The docks and factories drew in thousands of workers who came and went, and the district was a first port of call for immigrants from across Europe, particularly from Ireland and the Russian Empire. Familiarity was a luxury few could afford. The heart of this anonymity was the common lodging house, the flop house. There were over 200 such establishments in Whitechapel alone. For the price of a few pennies, a person could get a bed for the night in a large dormitory, often sharing the space with dozens of others. For even less, they could pay for a spot on the penny lean-to, a rope strung across a room upon which they could lean to sleep. The population of these houses turned over almost completely every single night. A face seen on a Tuesday might be gone by Wednesday, replaced by another, equally desperate soul. This constant churn of humanity made it impossible to notice if someone was out of place. A stranger asking questions would not raise suspicion. A man lingering in a dark doorway would be just another shadow among thousands. A person's disappearance might not even be registered for days or weeks. In this sea of strangers, the killer was just another face in the crowd, his presence unremarkable, his movements untracked. He could live there, work there, and kill there, all while remaining utterly invisible. This environment of darkness and anonymity led directly to the vulnerability of his victims. The women he targeted, known euphemistically as the unfortunates, were at the absolute bottom of this social hierarchy. Driven to sex work by alcoholism, abuse, or sheer economic desperation, their very survival depended on a constant, terrible risk. Their trade required them to be alone with strange men. It required them to lead these men away from the relative safety of the pub or the main street, and into the dark, secluded corners of the labyrinth where a transaction could take place in private. The killer, therefore, did not have to stalk his victims in the traditional sense. He did not have to hunt. He simply had to present himself as a potential client. The dire circumstances of these women's lives forced them to walk willingly with their own murderer into the very places he had chosen for his work. It is the most tragic and brutal irony of the case. The victims were not just random targets, but active participants in their own final moments. Their poverty and desperation cruelly exploited as the key element of the killer's method. Finally, the Ripper was protected by a wall of silence, built from the deep and abiding distrust between the people of Whitechapel and the police. The Metropolitan Police were not seen as protectors by the district's poor. They were viewed as an occupying force, the enforcers of laws made by the wealthy men of the West End. The constables were there to crack down on public drunkenness, on petty theft, on illegal street vending, on the very activities that were often the only means of survival for the residents. To interact with a policeman was to invite trouble into your life, to risk being arrested yourself. This meant that even if a resident saw or heard something suspicious, their first instinct would be to turn away, to mind their own business, to say nothing. Snitching was a dangerous game, and there was no guarantee that the police would or even could protect you. This culture of silence created an information vacuum around the investigation. Inspector Abberline was desperate for witnesses, for any small detail that might give him a lead, but he was working in a community that had learned, for its own protection, to see nothing and to say nothing. And so, the stage was set. A physical labyrinth of absolute darkness, a social labyrinth of complete anonymity, a vulnerable population forced into taking terrible risks, and a community shrouded in a wall of silence. The killer did not need to be a nobleman, a doctor, or a demonic genius. He only needed to understand the dark ecosystem of Whitechapel. He was a predator who had found a jungle where every shadow, every corner, and every silence worked to his advantage, allowing him to hunt, to kill, and to vanish, leaving a city and a world to wonder forever who or what he was. Into this urban maze of darkness and despair walked the men of the Metropolitan Police. The London Peeler, named for the force's founder, Sir Robert Peel, was a symbol of order in a city teetering on chaos. Clad in a heavy blue uniform and a distinctive custodian helmet, armed with little more than a wooden truncheon and a loud whistle, his job was not primarily to solve crimes, but to prevent them through sheer presence. He was a human scarecrow, a visible deterrent walking a lonely, repetitive beat. But the creature that was about to emerge in Whitechapel was not a common thief deterred by a uniform. It was a new kind of monster, and the tools available to Inspector Abberline and his men were tragically, almost hopelessly, inadequate. The single greatest obstacle to the investigation was a concept that is now the cornerstone of all police work: the crime scene. In 1888, the forensic analysis of a crime scene was a science in its absolute infancy. When a constable discovered a body in a dark alleyway, his first instinct was not to preserve evidence, but to summon a doctor and remove the body from public view as quickly as possible. The precious, fleeting clues that might have told the killer's story were almost always immediately trampled, washed away, or simply ignored. Fingerprinting, the revolutionary science of identification, had been theorized, but it was not yet an accepted tool of Scotland Yard. The killer's hands were all over his victims, but the unique signatures they left behind in blood were invisible to the investigators. They were meaningless smudges, wiped away with a cloth. The same was true of blood itself. The idea of linking blood from the scene to a specific individual was the stuff of fantasy. The discovery of blood types was still more than a decade away. Crime scene photography existed, but it was a cumbersome and often gruesome art. It required a large, heavy camera, a tripod, and volatile magnesium flash plates that would cast a harsh, flat light over the scene, often creating more shadows than they revealed. The photographs from the Ripper case are a testament to the horror, particularly the infamous image of Mary Jane Kelly in her room, but they offered few real clues. They were a record of the brutality, not a roadmap to the killer. Without forensics, Abberline had to rely on the oldest and most unreliable of police methods: witness testimony and sheer manpower. The investigation was a grueling, frustrating exercise in brute force. Hundreds of officers were assigned to the case, conducting house-to-house searches and interviewing thousands of residents in the flop houses and tenements. But in the dark, foggy streets, witness descriptions were wildly contradictory. The killer was described as tall and short, stout and thin, well-dressed and shabby. In a place of shadows, every man was a suspect, and no man had a clear face. Public appeals for information resulted in a deluge of over 1,000 letters sent to the police and the press, the vast majority of which were cruel hoaxes or the work of cranks, burying the investigators in a mountain of useless paperwork. As the investigation floundered, the police surgeon, Dr. Thomas Bond, provided Abberline with a document that was both brilliant and terrifying. After performing the autopsy on Mary Jane Kelly, Bond went beyond the physical evidence and created one of the world's first ever offender profiles. He described the killer not by his appearance, but by his psychology. The man, he wrote, was likely of a quiet, inoffensive appearance. He was physically strong, cool, and daring, and he was subject to periodical attacks of homicidal and erotic mania. In this moment, the nature of the hunt changed. Abberline and his men were forced to realize they were not just chasing a criminal seeking profit or revenge. They were hunting a new type of predator, a man who killed for the sake of killing, a monster whose motives were buried deep in a diseased mind. They were mapping a territory that had no name. And so, the three great antagonists of the case were established. First, the killer himself, a phantom armed with a knife and a terrible compulsion. Second, the city of Whitechapel, a labyrinth that offered him perfect cover. And third, time itself, for the tools that might have identified him had not yet been invented. Inspector Abberline, a brilliant detective, was left to fight a ghost in the dark, armed with little more than a notebook, his own sharp intellect, and a growing sense of dread. The stage was set, and the autumn of terror was about to begin. The story of Jack the Ripper does not begin with the killer, for he has no true beginning. It begins with his victims. It begins in the final, suffocating days of August 1888. The oppressive heat of the summer had not yet broken, and the air in Whitechapel was thick and stagnant, heavy with the smell of the tanneries and the unwashed masses. The nights offered little relief, the darkness trapping the day's heat between the high brick walls of the tenements. It was in the pre-dawn hours of the last day of this grim month, August 31st, that the Phantom of Whitechapel chose his first canonical victim, and in doing so, stepped out of the shadows and into history. Her name was Mary Ann Nichols, but she was known to the few who knew her as Polly. She was 43 years old, a woman whose life story was a testament to the quiet, grinding tragedies that were the daily reality for so many in the East End. But Polly was not born into this life of desperation. She was a daughter, a wife, and a mother. Born in London, she had married a printer's machinist named William Nichols, and together they had 5 children. For a time, they had a life of respectable, working-class stability. But like so many stories in this era, hers was a story of a slow, inexorable fall. The marriage collapsed, strained by her father's affair and Polly's own growing struggle with alcoholism. She drifted away from her family, cycling through the brutal and unforgiving institutions designed for the poor. She moved between the grim, prison-like workhouses and the chaotic, disease-ridden common lodging houses of Whitechapel. Her life became a daily struggle for the 4pence for a bed that represented the only alternative to a night spent on the cold, hard cobblestones. She was, by all accounts, a woman of small stature, with dark hair turning grey and several missing front teeth, a common feature in an age of poor nutrition and non-existent dentistry. But she had a resilience, a stubborn refusal to be completely broken by the world. On the evening of August 30th, that resilience was being tested to its limit. She was seen in a pub, having spent what little money she had on gin. Later, at her lodging house on Thrall Street, she was turned away by the deputy. She lacked the 4pence for her bed. "Never mind," she reportedly told him, her spirits seemingly undimmed. "I'll soon get my DOS money. See what a fine bonnet I've got now." She was pointing to a new, small, black straw bonnet, a tiny scrap of dignity in a life that afforded her so little. She walked out of the lodging house and into the Whitechapel night, intending to earn the few pennies she needed by selling herself on the street. It was the last time she was seen alive. At approximately 3:40 in the morning, a cart driver named Charles Cross was walking down Bucks Row, a dark and quiet street, on his way to work. In the gloom, he saw what he thought was a bundle of canvas lying on the ground near a stable entrance. As he drew closer, he realized it was the form of a woman. He called over to another man walking nearby, Robert Paul. Together they approached the figure. The woman's skirts were raised, and in the near total darkness, they assumed she was simply drunk and had passed out, a common enough sight. They felt for a pulse, for the warmth of breath, but there was nothing. Concerned but not yet horrified, they pulled her skirts down to give her some dignity, and, not wanting to be late for work, they continued on their way, informing the first constable they saw of their discovery. That constable was PC John Neal. He arrived at Bucks Row moments later and lit the scene with his oil lantern, his bullseye. In the flickering, focused beam of light, the true nature of the scene was revealed. The woman was lying on her back, her new black bonnet still on her head. Her eyes were open, and her throat had been cut with such savage force that her head was almost severed from her body. A local surgeon, Dr. Henry Llewellyn, was summoned from his home nearby. In the dim light of the lantern, he quickly confirmed that the woman was dead and had been for no more than half an hour. He noted the deep gash in her throat, but the full extent of the horror remained hidden beneath her clothes. The murder of a prostitute in the East End, while tragic, was not an unprecedented event. The initial police reports treated it as a brutal but otherwise standard case. It was only later, after Polly Nichols' body had been taken to the Whitechapel mortuary, that the true, terrifying nature of the crime was discovered. When the workhouse attendant removed Polly's clothes for examination, she revealed a series of deep, vicious, and deliberate cuts to the woman's abdomen. The killer had not just murdered her, he had disemboweled her, his knife moving with a terrifying, jagged precision. This discovery changed everything. This was not a robbery gone wrong, or a drunken argument that had turned fatal. The motive was not money, for her few possessions were untouched. The motive was the act of mutilation itself. This was something new, something that spoke of a deep and horrifying pathology. The local police at H Division, faced with a crime of such unprecedented brutality and with no immediate motive or suspect, knew they were out of their depth. The case file landed on the desk of Chief Inspector Frederick Abberline at Scotland Yard. He was the man they called when a case was too strange, too difficult for the local divisions. As he read the initial reports, the account of the two deep cuts to the throat, the savage, targeted mutilation of the abdomen, he would have felt a cold chill. The sensational details were already leaking to the press, and a tremor of fear was running through the East End. Abberline, a man of logic and experience, was now tasked with hunting a killer whose methods were unlike anything he had ever seen. He was standing at the edge of a dark and bloody mystery, with no idea that this was only the first chapter in a story that would terrorize a city and create a legend of pure evil. In the week that followed the murder of Polly Nichols, a palpable tremor of fear ran through the East End. The gruesome details of the crime, embellished by the penny dreadfuls and the sensationalist press, became whispered ghost stories in the gin palaces and lodging houses. The newspapers christened the unknown assailant the Whitechapel murderer, a faceless bogeyman who haunted the dark alleys of the imagination. Inspector Abberline and the men of H Division flooded the streets, increasing patrols and conducting hundreds of interviews with the district's unfortunates. But the Labyrinth of Whitechapel offered up no secrets. No witnesses came forward. No credible suspects emerged. As the days passed without another incident, the raw edge of panic began to dull. Whitechapel was a place accustomed to violence and sudden death. Perhaps, the residents hoped, the horror of Bucks Row was an isolated event, a singular nightmare that would not be repeated. It was a fragile hope, and it was shattered on the morning of September 8th. The second life to be claimed was that of Annie Chapman. Like Polly Nichols, Annie's story was one of a life that had once held the promise of stability, only to unravel into the familiar, tragic pattern of the East End. At 47 years old, Annie was known as a more refined figure than many of the other women in the lodging houses. She had once been married to a gentleman's coachman, and for years they had lived a comfortable life in Windsor, raising 3 children. But their world had been fractured by tragedy. Their eldest daughter died of meningitis, and Annie, consumed with a grief she could not overcome, descended into a deep and desperate alcoholism. The marriage fell apart, and after her husband's death from cirrhosis of the liver, her small allowance ceased. She was left adrift, eventually washing up in the grim lodging houses of Spitalfields. She was known as Dark Annie for her dark brown hair. She was a skilled craftswoman, earning a few pennies from her crochet work, selling flowers, and, when all else failed, selling herself. She was often sick, suffering from a lung condition, but she maintained a sense of pride, a memory of the better life she had once known. On the night of her death, she had been involved in a fight with another woman at her lodging house on Dorset Street. Later, penniless and bruised, she was told by the deputy that she could not stay without her 4pence for a bed. Her final, fateful words were heard by a watchman around 1:30 in the morning. "It will be no long for me to be back," she said. "I must go and get some money to pay for my bed." She walked out into the darkness of Hanbury Street and into the path of the waiting predator. At a few minutes before 6 a.m, the sun had just begun to rise, burning through the thick London smog. A resident of number 29 Hanbury Street, a man named John Davis, was heading to the backyard of the tenement building. As he opened the back door, he was met with a sight that stopped his heart. Lying on the ground, between the steps and the fence, was the body of a woman. It was Annie Chapman. Her head was turned towards the house, her clothes pulled up to her chest. Davis ran for help, and soon the yard was swarming with police. This time, the scene was different. This was not a dark, deserted street like Bucks Row. It was the enclosed backyard of a bustling, fully occupied tenement building. The killer had grown bolder, operating within feet of sleeping residents. The initial examination by the police surgeon, Dr. George Bagster Phillips, confirmed their worst fears. The cause of death was the same: 2 deep, savage cuts to the throat. And beneath her clothes lay the same horrific, targeted mutilation of the abdomen. The pattern was undeniable. This was the work of the same man. But as Dr. Phillips continued his grim work, he discovered a new, horrifying escalation in the killer's methods. He noted that several of the woman's personal effects, some coins, a piece of an envelope, had been arranged neatly by her feet, a small, almost ceremonial detail. And then came the discovery that would send a shockwave of pure terror through the city. The killer had not just disemboweled his victim, he had dissected her. With a chilling, surgical precision, he had excised her uterus and a portion of her bladder, and he had taken them from the scene. This was the detail that transformed the case from a series of brutal murders into something that felt almost supernatural. This was not a crime of passion or rage. The removal of the organs was a cold, deliberate act. It suggested a motive that was utterly alien to the investigators, the collection of human trophies. It also suggested a degree of anatomical knowledge, however crude, that immediately gave birth to the terrifying theory of a mad doctor or a demented surgeon stalking the streets. The killer was not just a brute, he was a ghoul with a purpose. When this information hit the press, the city erupted in a full-blown panic. The name, the Whitechapel murderer, was no longer sufficient. The papers, in a frenzy of sensationalism, dubbed the killer Leather Apron, based on some flimsy testimony about a local man who was known to intimidate prostitutes. This moniker created a folk devil, and for days, vigilante mobs roamed the streets, hunting for anyone who fit the description. The fear was a tangible thing, a poison that seeped into every home. Women were afraid to go out after dark. Men armed themselves. The streets of Whitechapel, usually so full of life, became eerily quiet at night. For Inspector Abberline, the case had now become a waking nightmare. He had two victims, a clear and terrifying pattern of escalating brutality, and a killer who was growing bolder with each act. The press was whipping the public into a frenzy. The government was demanding answers, and he was no closer to finding his man. The Phantom of Whitechapel was no longer just a murderer. He was a collector of organs, a monster with a purpose that no sane man could comprehend. Abberline now knew, with a certainty that must have chilled him to his core, that this was only the beginning. The hunter was still out there in the labyrinth, and he would undoubtedly kill again. The murder of Annie Chapman plunged Whitechapel into a new and deeper level of fear. The 3 weeks that followed were a period of intense, frantic activity and suffocating paranoia. Inspector Abberline's men were a constant presence, their heavy boots echoing on the cobblestones at all hours. Hundreds of suspects were questioned and released. The press, smelling blood and profit, fanned the flames of panic with ever more lurid headlines and gruesome illustrations. Local business owners, led by a builder named George Lusk, formed the Whitechapel Vigilance Committee, offering a reward for the killer's capture and hiring their own private detectives to patrol the streets. The entire district was on a razor's edge. Every shadow held a potential monster. Every stranger was met with suspicion. But as days bled into weeks, the constant state of high alert began to exhaust itself. There were no new attacks. The police presence was immense. A fragile, unspoken hope began to circulate. Perhaps the killer, spooked by the citywide manhunt, had fled, been arrested for some other crime, or simply quenched his thirst for blood. The terror, it seemed, might be over. This hope was brutally extinguished in the early morning hours of September 30th. On this night, the Ripper would not claim one victim, but two, creating a spectacle of violence so audacious it would paralyze the city and make his name infamous throughout the world. The first to die was a woman named Elizabeth Stride, known as Long Liz due to her height. She was a Swedish immigrant who, like the others, had seen a life of stability crumble into the familiar cycle of the Whitechapel lodging houses. She had once owned a coffee shop with her husband, but the marriage failed, and she was left to fend for herself. She was known as a quiet woman, well liked by those who shared the grim dormitories with her, occasionally earning a few pennies from sewing and char work. On the night of her death, she was seen in and out of pubs, trying to earn the money for her bed. She was last seen alive around 12:45 a.m., talking to a man near Dutefield's Yard, a dark passage off Berner Street. At precisely 1:00 a.m., a man named Louis Diemschutz, the steward of a working men's club located deep within the yard, turned his pony and cart into the narrow passage. The yard was pitch black, and as he moved forward, his pony suddenly shied, refusing to go further. DM Schutz peered into the darkness and saw a dark shape on the ground. Thinking it was a drunkard, he tried to rouse the figure with his whip, but got no response. He dismounted and struck a match. In the brief, flickering flare of light, he saw the figure was a woman. He saw the silk scarf around her neck. And he saw a torrent of bright, red blood flowing into the gutter. He had found the body of Elizabeth Stride. When the police and Dr. Phillips arrived, they discovered a scene of shocking immediacy. Elizabeth's throat had been cut with the same savage efficiency as the previous victims. But her body was otherwise untouched. There were no abdominal mutilations. The doctor, noting that her body was still warm, concluded that she had been killed mere moments before DM Schutz entered the yard. The implication was electrifying. The killer had been interrupted. DM Schutz and his pony had, in all likelihood, scared the Ripper away in the very act of beginning his ghastly ritual. A frustrated predator is a dangerous predator. The news of the interrupted murder sent a wave of panic through the police. The killer was still out there, in the immediate vicinity, his bloodlust unfulfilled. Every available officer was dispatched to sweep the surrounding streets. But the phantom had already melted back into the labyrinth. He had not fled. He had simply gone to find another victim to finish what he had started. Less than an hour later, and a mile away, Catherine Eddowes was walking through Mitre Square. Her story is one of the most tragic ironies of the case. She had been arrested earlier that evening, not for a serious crime, but for being drunk and disorderly in public. She was taken to Bishopsgate Police Station and held in a cell until she sobered up. She was, for a few hours, in the safest place in all of London. At 1:00 a.m., the same moment Elizabeth Stride was being murdered, Catherine was deemed sober enough for release. As the desk sergeant let her out, she smiled and gave him a cheerful parting line. "Good night, old cock." She gave a false name, Mary Kelly, and walked out into the night. At 1:44 a.m., a City of London policeman, PC Edward Watkins, walked his beat through the dark and deserted Mitre Square. He had passed through the same square just 14 minutes earlier at 1:30 a.m., and it had been empty. But now, in the corner of the square, he saw a crumpled form. He approached and shone his lantern on the body of Catherine Eddowes. He had found the Ripper's fourth victim. The killer, his ritual on Stride interrupted, had unleashed his full, horrific fury upon Eddowes. The mutilations were the most severe yet. Her throat was cut, her face was deliberately disfigured, with cuts to her nose and cheeks, and her abdomen had been ripped open. The police surgeon on the scene would later testify that her left kidney and her uterus had been skillfully removed and taken by the killer. The speed and silence of the act were beyond comprehension. In a window of no more than 14 minutes, in a public square, the killer had murdered a woman and performed a gruesome, lengthy dissection, all without making a sound or being seen. The audacity was inhuman. He had also crossed a jurisdictional boundary, killing in the City of London, a direct act of contempt for all police authority. But he had made a mistake, or perhaps he had left a deliberate clue. A few streets away, on Galston Street, another constable discovered a piece of Catherine Eddowes' apron stained with blood, lying in the entryway of a tenement building. And on the brick wall directly above it, someone had chalked a message. The writing was clear. "The Jews are the men that will not be blamed for nothing." This was the first and only tangible clue left at any of the scenes. But it was a firebrand. The message, with its misspelling of Jews, was dangerously inflammatory. Anti-Semitic sentiment was high in the area, and Abberline and his superiors feared the message could trigger riots. The head of the Metropolitan Police, Sir Charles Warren, arrived on the scene and made one of the most controversial decisions of the entire case. Fearing a riot more than the loss of a clue, he ordered the writing to be washed from the wall before it could be properly photographed. The only piece of physical evidence was destroyed, a decision that would fuel accusations of a cover-up for decades to come. The city, which had been in a state of panic, was now gripped by a collective shrieking terror. A killer who could murder 2 women in an hour in 2 different police districts was not a man. He was a monster, a ghoul, a demon. The final, horrifying punctuation to the night's events arrived a few weeks later. George Lusk, the head of the Whitechapel Vigilance Committee, received a small cardboard box in the mail. The spelling and grammar of the accompanying letter were poor, the handwriting unsteady. It began with the now infamous words, "From hell." The writer claimed he had taken the kidney from one of the victims and had fried and ate it. To prove his claim, inside the box, nestled in paper, was half of a preserved human kidney. Medical examination confirmed it was indeed a human kidney and that it had been preserved in alcohol. Most of the hundreds of letters sent to the police and press were dismissed as cruel hoaxes. But the From Hell letter, with its gruesome trophy, was different. It is considered by most ripperologists and was believed by Inspector Abberline himself to be the only authentic communication from the killer. The phantom now had a voice. It was the voice of a taunting, cannibalistic monster who openly mocked the men who hunted him. For Abberline, the case had become a personal torment. The killer was everywhere and nowhere. He left a trail of butchered bodies and cryptic clues that led only to more questions. The double event had shattered the nerve of the city, and Abberline was no closer to an answer. He was simply waiting, along with the rest of London, for the Ripper's knife to fall again. In the wake of the double event, the city of London held its breath, waiting for the next blow to fall, but it never came. October arrived, and the nights grew colder. The leaves of the plane trees turned brown and fell, carpeting the muddy streets of Whitechapel. And still, there was silence. The massive police presence, the vigilance committees, and the sheer white-hot spotlight of public attention seemed to have finally driven the monster into hiding. The press, with no new bodies to report on, moved on to other, less terrifying stories. The people of the East End, though still wary, began to tentatively reclaim their nights. A fragile, exhausted sense of normalcy began to return. The autumn of terror, it seemed, had come to an end. For over 5 weeks, the phantom who had haunted the city was silent. Many believed he was gone for good, fled, imprisoned, or perhaps even dead. It was a comforting thought, a desperate hope that the nightmare was finally over. But the nightmare had only been sleeping, and on the 9th of November, it would awaken for one final, horrific performance. The last of the canonical victims was different from the others. Mary Jane Kelly was younger, just 25 years old, and by all accounts, a striking beauty. Her story is more enigmatic than the others, a tapestry woven from rumour and the fond, perhaps embellished, memories of those who knew her. She was said to have come from a well-to-do family in Wales or Ireland, and had been trapped in an unhappy marriage at a young age. After her husband's death, she drifted to London and, for a time, was said to have worked in a high-class brothel in the opulent West End. She was a woman who had known a finer world, and she carried a memory of that life with her into the squalor of Whitechapel. Here, she lived in a single, small room at number 13 Miller's Court, a grim, secluded courtyard hidden away behind the busy thoroughfare of Dorset Street, known then as the worst street in London. To have her own room, however small, was a luxury that set her apart from the other victims, who were relegated to the anonymity of the common lodging houses. She was known as a vibrant, spirited woman, though prone to fits of temper when she drank. For over a year, she had lived with a man named Joseph Barnett, and their relationship, though stormy, seemed to be one of genuine affection. But a few days before her death, after a violent argument, Barnett moved out, leaving Mary Kelly alone and, critically, without the money for her rent. Like Polly, Annie, and the others before her, she was forced back onto the streets to find a client, her desperation making her a target. On the cold, drizzly morning of November the 9th, a man named Thomas Bowyer, who worked for Mary's landlord, was sent to collect her overdue rent. He arrived at Miller's Court shortly before 11:00 a.m. He knocked on the door of number 13. There was no answer. He knocked again, louder this time. Silence. The door was locked from the inside. Annoyed, Bowyer walked around to the side of the small room, to a window where a single pane of glass had been broken and stuffed with rags. He reached his hand through the broken pane, pushed aside the grimy curtain that served as a screen, and peered inside. The sight that met his eyes was one of such profound, surreal horror that his mind could not, at first, comprehend it. The room was not just the scene of a murder. It was an abattoir, a butcher's shop, an artist's studio of human disassembly. He saw a table, and on it, what looked like a pile of flesh. He saw the bed, and on it, a sight so monstrous, so far beyond the bounds of human experience, that he could only recoil in shock, his mind shutting down in the face of the impossible. He ran, shaking, to find his employer, and soon the police were summoned. Inspector Abberline arrived on the scene to a sight that would haunt him for the rest of his life. Unlike the other murders, which were hurried acts committed in the darkness of public alleyways, this one was different. The killer had been indoors. The door was locked. A fire had been burning in the grate, providing him with ample light to see his work. The killer had not been rushed. He had been comfortable. He had taken his time. He had been at work for hours. What the police found inside 13 Miller's Court is almost beyond description. Mary Kelly had been so completely and systematically dismembered that the first officers on the scene could barely identify the remains as human. The killer had performed a ritual of absolute annihilation. Her organs, her heart, her liver, her kidneys, had been removed and deliberately placed around the room. Some were on the table, some by her feet, some under her head. Her face had been completely stripped of its skin and features, rendered an unrecognizable mask of red tissue. The flesh had been carved from her thighs and placed on the bedside table. The room was a tableau of carnage, a horrifying, deliberate arrangement of a deconstructed human being. The hardened police officers and doctors who entered that room were left speechless and, in some cases, physically ill. One reporter who managed to glimpse the scene simply wrote that it was a sight that no man who has seen it could ever forget. This was not the work of a man in a rage. This was the work of a creature completely detached from all humanity, a man so consumed by his madness that he could spend hours in a small, locked room with his victim, meticulously performing his ghastly work by the light of a flickering fire. This was the savage peak, the absolute summit of the killer's escalating violence. It was a final, monstrous statement of his power and his contempt for humanity. And then, after this terrible crescendo, the most baffling event of all occurred. Nothing. The murders stopped. After the butchery of Mary Jane Kelly, Jack the Ripper, the phantom who had held the world's most powerful city in a grip of pure terror, vanished. There were no more letters, no more bodies, no more taunts. The killer who had escalated his violence with each crime, culminating in the horror of Miller's Court, simply ceased to exist. The question that tormented Inspector Abberline and has haunted historians for over a century is why? Why, after reaching this terrible peak, did he disappear? Had he finally been satisfied? Had he died, taking his secret to the grave? Was he an immigrant who simply sailed away? Or was he captured for another crime and locked away, his jailers never knowing they held the most infamous killer in history? The storm, which had raged so violently, was suddenly over. It left in its wake a devastated community, a traumatized police force, and a series of questions that would never be answered. The Phantom had completed his final, terrible masterpiece, and then he had simply walked back into the labyrinth of the city and was never seen again. The discovery inside 13 Miller's Court was the final, brutal punctuation mark on the Autumn of Terror. The 5-week silence that had preceded it was revealed to be not an ending, but a pause. A moment for the killer to nurture his rage into its most monstrous and final form. The hope that had cautiously begun to bloom in Whitechapel was ripped out by the roots. The monster was not gone. He was more savage than ever, and the public's reaction was no longer just fear. It was a cold, hard fury, directed not only at the Phantom in the alleys, but at the police force that had so spectacularly failed to catch him. In the aftermath of Mary Kelly's murder, Inspector Abberline and the men of Scotland Yard and H Division unleashed the largest and most intensive manhunt the City of London had ever seen. The investigation, which had already been a massive undertaking, now swelled to an unprecedented scale. It was a desperate, city-wide search for a needle in a haystack, but the haystack was the entirety of the London slums, and it was on fire with panic and misinformation. The core of the effort was a colossal, grinding exercise in boots-on-the-ground police work. A human dragnet was cast over the district of Whitechapel. Hundreds of uniformed and plain-clothed officers were deployed in a systematic, house-by-house, room-by-room search of the common lodging houses. Night after night, they would raid these teeming dormitories, rousing hundreds of sleeping men from their bunks. They would examine their hands for cuts, their clothes for bloodstains, their meager possessions for any incriminating evidence. They were searching for a ghost in a crowd of thousands, and every man was a potential suspect. The scale of the interviews was staggering. In the weeks and months that followed, the police officially questioned more than 2,000 people. Hundreds were detained for further interrogation, their lives and backgrounds meticulously picked apart before being released. The investigators were drowning in a sea of data, a vast collection of testimony, alibis, and accusations. They spoke with butchers, slaughterhouse workers, and surgeons, anyone who might possess the anatomical knowledge the killer seemed to display. They interviewed sailors in the docks and residents of the grim local asylums, and they returned, again and again, to the district's unfortunates, interviewing hundreds of prostitutes, begging them for any detail about a client who seemed strange, violent, or out of place. These women were the most valuable potential witnesses, but they were also the most terrified, knowing that to be seen talking to the police could be a death sentence, either from the killer or from the violent gangs who controlled them. This physical manhunt was mirrored by an administrative nightmare. The police printed and distributed more than 80,000 handbills across London, pleading with the public for any information and posting the grim details of the murders. The hope was that someone, somewhere, had seen something or harbored a suspicion about a neighbor, a lodger, or even a family member. These appeals, however, created their own kind of chaos. The From Hell letter, believed to be authentic, had legitimized the idea that the killer was a correspondent. This opened the floodgates. Scotland Yard was inundated with thousands of letters, each one claiming to be from the Ripper. The vast majority were cruel hoaxes, but every single one had to be logged, read, and assessed, burying the detectives in a mountain of false confessions and deranged ramblings. The investigation became a national obsession, and the police were not the only ones hunting the killer. The Whitechapel Vigilance Committee, led by George Lusk, redoubled its efforts. They offered their own substantial reward, hired private detectives, and conducted their own patrols, sometimes interfering with the official police work, but also acting as the eyes and ears of a terrified community. The case had also given birth to a new phenomenon, the amateur detective. Every citizen with a theory felt compelled to share it. Innkeepers reported suspicious patrons. Neighbors accused each other over petty disputes. The city was awash with rumor and paranoia. Anyone with a foreign accent, anyone who carried a black bag, anyone who worked a strange schedule could find themselves the subject of a vicious rumor that could lead to a police interview, or worse, a vigilante mob. For Inspector Abberline, the pressure was immense and unrelenting. He was a man besieged. His superiors at Scotland Yard, particularly the embattled Commissioner Sir Charles Warren, demanded a result. The sensationalist press, led by editors like W.T. Stead, published scathing articles every day, accusing the police of incompetence and presenting their own wild theories as fact. And the public, through thousands of letters and constant scrutiny, demanded the capture of the monster who had violated their sense of safety. Abberline and his core team of inspectors worked around the clock, often sleeping in their offices, their lives consumed by the case. They were men haunted by the faces of the victims and frustrated by the utter lack of progress. They had a phantom who left no reliable witnesses, a killer who chose his victims from a class of women whose lives were undocumented and whose disappearances were tragically common, a murderer who operated in a city that was a perfect accomplice, its dark alleys and anonymous crowds providing him with the perfect cover. The desperate hunt was a search for a man without a face, without a clear motive, and without a single, verifiable clue to his name. It was from this vast, chaotic, and exhaustive trawl through the London underworld that a handful of names began to float to the surface. They were not men connected to the crimes by any physical evidence, for there was none. They were phantoms themselves, individuals who, through their profession, their personal crises, or their mental state, emerged from the fog of the investigation as plausible suspects. They were the names that would be written down in the margins of police files, the names that Abberline and his men would return to again and again, long after the case had gone cold. They were the men who would, for the next century and beyond, be known as the prime suspects in the greatest murder mystery of all time. From the swirling fog of rumor and the mountain of fruitless paperwork that defined the Ripper investigation, a handful of names eventually emerged. These were not men condemned by evidence, but phantoms identified by circumstance, suspicion, and the desperate logic of exhausted detectives. And for decades, the name at the very top of Scotland Yard's secret list was a man who, on the surface, could not have been further removed from the squalor of Whitechapel. He was not a butcher, a bootmaker, or a destitute immigrant. He was a barrister, a public school teacher, and a gentleman. His name was Montague John Druitt. Druitt existed in a different universe from the Ripper's victims. He was the son of a prominent surgeon, raised in the green, respectable county of Dorset. He was a gifted scholar and a talented athlete, having attended the prestigious Winchester College and later Oxford University, where he earned a degree in classics. By 1888, he was living a seemingly respectable life, working as a barrister in the law courts and supplementing his income as an assistant headmaster at a boarding school in Blackheath, a leafy suburb miles away from the East End. He was, by all accounts, a man of privilege and education, a product of the very Victorian society the Ripper seemed so intent on terrorizing. And yet, his name would become inextricably linked with the Whitechapel murders, primarily due to one tantalizing and deeply suspicious coincidence: the timing of his death. The final, horrific murder of Mary Jane Kelly occurred on November 9th, 1888. After that, the Ripper killings, which had terrorized the city for months, abruptly stopped. Just a few weeks later, on December the 1st, Montague Druitt vanished. He was last seen leaving his boarding school, having been mysteriously dismissed from his post the day before. For a month, his whereabouts were unknown. Then, on the last day of the year, December 31st, his body was discovered floating in the River Thames, his pockets weighted down with stones. The coroner ruled his death a suicide, concluding that he had taken his own life while in a state of unsound mind. For the police, this timeline was a revelation. The murders ceased at the exact moment their prime suspect disappeared and killed himself. To the investigators grappling with the killer's sudden silence, this was a near-perfect solution. The phantom had not fled, he had destroyed himself, taking his terrible secret with him to his watery grave. This theory was cemented years later in a famous private memorandum written in 1894 by Sir Melville Macnaghten, the Assistant Chief Constable of the CID. Macnaghten, who had access to all the police files on the case, named 3 men as the most likely suspects. At the very top of his list was Montague John Druitt. Macnaghten wrote that he had reason to believe the killer was Druitt, stating with confidence that the suspect was a doctor, and that his own family said to have believed him to have been the murderer. He described Druitt as sexually insane, suggesting that a hidden depraved side to his personality had driven him to commit the atrocities. Macnaghten's memo provides the most compelling piece of evidence in the case against Druitt. The belief, however second-hand, of his own family that he was the Ripper. The narrative it creates is almost irresistible. A respectable, educated man leading a double life. He is secretly afflicted with a madness, perhaps a hereditary one, that drives him to commit unspeakable acts in the city's dark underbelly. This madness finally consumes him, or perhaps he fears his crimes are about to be exposed. He takes his own life, and the terror ends. It is a neat, tidy, and dramatically satisfying conclusion to an otherwise chaotic and unresolved case. But like everything in the Ripper investigation, when you hold this theory up to the light, cracks begin to appear. First, and most importantly, there is not a single shred of direct physical evidence or witness testimony to connect Montague Druitt to Whitechapel or to any of the victims. His name never came up in any of the thousands of interviews conducted at the time. The entire case against him is purely circumstantial, built upon the coincidence of his suicide. The suicide itself, upon closer inspection, has a much simpler and more tragic explanation. The note found on Druitt's body read, "Since Friday, I felt I was going to be like Mother, and the best thing for me was to die." This was a clear reference to a known family tragedy. His mother had suffered from severe depression and had been committed to a lunatic asylum where she died. His grandmother, too, had taken her own life. Druitt, who had just been fired from his job for reasons that remain unclear, was likely terrified that he was succumbing to the same hereditary mental illness that had claimed the women in his family. His suicide note is not the confession of a serial killer, but the desperate act of a man who feared he was losing his mind. Furthermore, Macnaghten's influential memo contains several glaring errors. He refers to Druitt as a 41-year-old doctor, when in fact, Druitt was a 31-year-old barrister. This basic mistake calls into question the accuracy of his other, more sensational claims. The assertion that Druitt was sexually insane is an unsubstantiated leap of logic, likely a projection by the police to fit their theory of the crime. There is no independent evidence to suggest Druitt had any such tendencies. The most damning piece of evidence that his own family believed he was the killer is also problematic. It's a second-hand claim, written years after the fact, and there is no record of which family member ever said this or why they might have believed it. Finally, there is the simple matter of logistics. Druitt was a man of the suburbs. For him to repeatedly travel from Blackheath into Whitechapel at night, commit the murders, and return home without attracting any attention would have been an immense challenge. The killer displayed an intimate knowledge of the Whitechapel Labyrinth, an ability to navigate its dark alleys and escape routes that suggests a local man, someone who knew the territory as his own. Druitt, the Oxford-educated barrister, simply does not fit the profile of a man who could move through the East End like a ghost. So we are left with a phantom suspect. The case for Montague John Druitt is a compelling one, built on the powerful coincidence of his suicide. It provides a clean and convenient end to the story, but the case against him is equally strong, built on a complete lack of evidence and a series of more logical, tragic explanations for his actions. Was he a respectable gentleman who harbored a monstrous, secret life? A man of logic and learning who descended into a savage madness, only to be consumed by his own guilt? Or was Montague John Druitt simply another victim of the year 1888? A man who lost a private battle with his own demons, and whose tragic death was posthumously hijacked to become the convenient, but ultimately unproven final chapter in a story that, in truth, has no ending. If Montague John Druitt represents the theory of a killer from the outside world, a gentleman slumming in the dark, our next suspect is his polar opposite. He is a ghost from within, a man who lived and breathed the desperate air of Whitechapel, whose life was contained entirely within the few grimy streets where the Ripper hunted. He was a Polish Jewish immigrant, a hairdresser by trade, and a man whose mind was slowly, tragically collapsing into a world of paranoia and delusion. His name was Aaron Kosminski. Kosminski's story was a common one in the East End. He was born in the town of Kładawa in Poland, which was then part of the Russian Empire. Fleeing the state-sponsored persecution and pogroms that terrorized the Jewish population, he and his family, like thousands of others, made the long journey to London in the early 1880s, settling in the immigrant heartland of Whitechapel. For a time, he worked as a hairdresser, a common profession in the area. But Kosminski was not well. His behavior grew more and more erratic over the years. His family noted his decline, his descent into a private world of auditory hallucinations, paranoid fears, and a refusal to engage with the world around him. He was a marginal, troubled figure, one of thousands of struggling souls in the great, anonymous machine of the city. But it is this very profile that makes him such a compelling suspect. Unlike Druitt, Kosminski had no need for a train schedule. He lived there. He knew the labyrinth of alleys and courtyards intimately because it was his backyard. His deteriorating mental state fits the profile of a disorganized, rage-filled killer far more neatly than that of a respectable barrister. And most importantly, he was a man who was directly on the police's radar. Our first clue to this comes, once again, from Sir Melville Macnaghten's 1894 memorandum. After naming Druitt, Macnaghten lists Kosminski as his second major suspect. He describes him as a Polish Jew who worked as a hairdresser in Whitechapel. Macnaghten writes that Kosminski had a great hatred of women with strong homicidal tendencies. He notes that Kosminski was eventually confined to a lunatic asylum in March of 1889, and that he resembled the man seen by a key witness. This is a strong statement from a senior police official, but it is the private notes of another, even more senior officer that truly cement Kosminski's place at the top of the suspect list. Chief Constable Donald Swanson was one of the key figures in the investigation, a man who worked closely with Inspector Abberline. Years later, Swanson was given a copy of the memoirs of the former head of the CID, Sir Robert Anderson. In the margins of the book, Swanson wrote a series of notes in his own hand, adding his private recollections to the official history. These notes, known as the Swanson marginalia, contain the most direct accusation made by any of the lead investigators. Swanson states that the Ripper was identified by a witness at a seaside home, a place where many of the convalescing poor were sent. The witness, however, who was also Jewish, refused to testify against the suspect, stating he would not give the evidence that would send a fellow Jew to the gallows. Without this key testimony, the police could not make a case. Swanson writes that after this identification, the suspect, Kosminski, was taken in hand by his family and sent to an asylum. Swanson concludes his note with a chilling certainty. The murderer was a Polish Jew resident in the district, and the murders ceased. This is a bombshell. According to one of the highest-ranking officers on the case, they had their man. They had a witness who positively identified him. But because of a witness's refusal to testify, the killer was never brought to justice, instead being quietly removed from society and locked away in an asylum. This theory, like Druitt's, provides a neat timeline. The murders stop, and shortly after, the man the police believe to be the killer is permanently institutionalized. The silence on the streets of Whitechapel is explained by the silence of a padded cell. For over a century, this was where the case against Kosminski stood, a compelling but ultimately unprovable accusation, hidden in the private notes of a long-dead policeman. But in the 21st century, the story took a dramatic and controversial turn. An author named Russell Edwards purchased a stained silk shawl that was said to have been found by the body of the fourth victim, Catherine Eddowes. The shawl had reportedly been passed down through the family of a constable who was on the scene that night. Edwards commissioned a team of genetic experts to test the shawl for surviving DNA evidence. The results, when they were published, were electrifying. The forensic scientists claimed to have found mitochondrial DNA on the shawl that could be matched to a living descendant of Catherine Eddowes. More sensationally, they also claimed to have found mitochondrial DNA that matched a living descendant of Aaron Kosminski's sister. The connection, it seemed, had finally been made. After more than 120 years, modern science had seemingly pointed its finger directly at the Polish hairdresser, confirming the suspicions of Swanson and Abberline. However, the case against Kosminski is far from closed. The scientific and historical evidence, when examined closely, is riddled with problems. First, his documented mental illness does not align well with the profile of the killer. While he was certainly very sick, his asylum records describe his condition as one of apathy, withdrawal, and self-neglect. He was noted for his refusal to wash and for eating food that had been thrown away. The records contain no mention of the violent, misogynistic rage that McNaughton and Swanson claimed he possessed. His madness appears to have been passive and internal, not the aggressive, explosive fury of the Ripper. The police case itself, as described by Swanson, is also built on shaky ground. It relies entirely on the hearsay of a single witness identification, an event for which there are no other corroborating records. It is a compelling story, but it is not verifiable evidence. And the modern DNA evidence, which at first seemed to be the smoking gun, has been heavily and credibly criticized. The provenance of the shawl itself is highly dubious. There is no mention of a shawl being collected as evidence in any of the original 1888 police files. The risk of contamination over more than a century, as the shawl was handled by countless individuals, is immense. And most critically, the specific methods and conclusions of the DNA analysis have been disputed by numerous geneticists, who argue that the type of DNA match found is not nearly as rare or as definitive as was initially claimed. The scientific consensus is that the shawl's DNA evidence is intriguing, but it is far from the conclusive proof needed to close the case. So we are left with another phantom. Was Aaron Kosminski, the man described by Chief Constable Swanson, a cunning and hate-filled killer whose madness was just barely contained and whose guilt was known to the police but could never be proven in a court of law? Or was he simply another tragic figure, a vulnerable and deeply unwell man, made a scapegoat by a desperate police force and later unfairly implicated by a piece of highly controversial modern science? The file on Aaron Kosminski, like that of Montague Druitt, remains open, his guilt or innocence a matter of tantalizing clues and enduring, unanswerable questions. Our first two suspects, Montague Druitt and Aaron Kosminski, are phantoms defined by their circumstances. A conveniently timed suicide, a descent into madness. We are forced to speculate about their capacity for evil. With our third major suspect, no such speculation is required. We know for a fact that he was a monster. We know he was a serial killer who took pleasure in the slow, agonizing deaths of the women in his life. He was tried, convicted, and hanged for his crimes. He was, without question, one of the most evil men in London, and he lived and worked in the heart of Whitechapel throughout the Autumn of Terror. His name was George Chapman, but he was born Suwarin Kłosowski. Like Kosminski, Kłosowski was a Polish immigrant who had arrived in London in the mid-1880s, and like Kosminski, he worked as a hairdresser in the East End. But unlike the tragically afflicted Kosminski, Kłosowski was sharp, intelligent, and ambitious. Crucially, before coming to England, he had worked as a feldsher in his native Poland, a kind of junior surgeon's assistant, a profession that would have given him a significant degree of anatomical knowledge. Upon arriving in London, he found work as a barber, a trade that, at the time, often included minor surgical procedures. He eventually opened his own barber shop on the corner of George Yard, a place of grim significance, for it was in George Yard that the body of the non-canonical victim Martha Tabram had been found. During the height of the Ripper panic, he was living and working right in the center of the murder map. But the truly compelling case for Chapman as the Ripper only emerged years later, in the early 1900s. By then, he had left barbering and become a pub owner. He had also embarked on a new and far more sinister career, that of a serial poisoner. Between 1897 and 1901, Chapman systematically murdered 3 of his common-law wives, one after another. His method was one of calculating, intimate cruelty. He would administer small, steady doses of a poison called antimony, a heavy metal that induced a slow, excruciatingly painful death that mimicked the symptoms of natural illness. He would watch them suffer for weeks, even months, feigning the role of a concerned husband, all while slowly, deliberately poisoning them to death so he could inherit their modest savings. It was during the investigation into the death of his third victim that his crimes were finally uncovered. The bodies of his 2 previous wives were exhumed. The telltale traces of antimony were found, and George Chapman, the charming publican, was revealed to be a cold, methodical monster. He was convicted and sentenced to hang in 1903. It was at this moment that the connection to the Jack the Ripper case exploded into public view. The officer who finally arrested Chapman was none other than Frederick Abberline, the man who had led the original Ripper hunt, now retired from the Metropolitan Police but working as a private detective. According to his former colleague, Inspector George Godley, after Chapman's conviction, Abberline turned to him and said, "You've got Jack the Ripper at last." This single electrifying statement from the lead investigator is the cornerstone of the case against George Chapman. Abberline, the man who knew the case better than anyone, was apparently convinced. The evidence, though circumstantial, seemed to align perfectly. Here was a man with proven medical knowledge, who lived in the right place at the right time, who was known to walk the streets at night, and who was a confirmed serial killer with a deep and venomous hatred of women. Furthermore, some theorists have proposed a chilling explanation for the timeline. They argue that a serial killer's methods can evolve. Chapman, they suggest, began his murderous career as Jack the Ripper, a high-risk, frenzied killer who vented his rage with a knife. But the massive police manhunt and the near misses made this method too dangerous. And so, he adapted. He de-escalated his methods, shifting from the chaotic, public butchery of the Ripper to the quiet, low-risk, and profitable method of poisoning. In this view, the murders didn't stop because the killer died or was locked away. They stopped because the killer changed his tactics, becoming a different, quieter kind of monster. It is a powerful and compelling theory. Yet, for all its neatness, the case against George Chapman as the Ripper faces one enormous, almost insurmountable obstacle: the profound and radical difference in his psychological profile. The vast majority of criminal profilers and criminologists agree that a killer's method, their modus operandi or MO, is a direct expression of their psychology. It is a ritual, and while it may evolve or refine over time, it rarely transforms into something completely different. The two sets of crimes, the Rippers and Chapmans, seem to have been committed by two fundamentally different types of men. Jack the Ripper was a disorganized, frenzied, and high-risk killer. His crimes were blitz-style attacks, likely committed in a matter of minutes in public or semi-public places. The violence was explosive and aimed at the abdomen. The motive appears to have been a deep-seated violent rage, a form of homicidal mania. He sought terror, and he took immense risks to achieve it. George Chapman, the poisoner, was the polar opposite. He was a highly organized, patient, and low-risk killer. His crimes were committed slowly, over weeks or months, in the privacy of his own home. The violence was passive and intimate. His motive was clear, rational, and cold: financial gain. He was not a creature of uncontrollable rage. He was a predator of cold, calculating greed. For Chapman to have been the Ripper, one must believe that a man can completely alter the core of his criminal personality. One must believe that a frenzied, rage-driven killer who risks everything for the thrill of the act could simply decide to become a patient, profit-driven poisoner. To most experts in criminal psychology, this switch is not just unlikely, it is borderline impossible. The fundamental fantasies and compulsions that drive a serial killer do not simply change on a whim. And what of Abberline's famous comment? While compelling, it remains a second-hand quote, reported years later. It may have been an excited, off-the-cuff remark rather than a definitive statement based on evidence. By 1903, Abberline was a man long haunted by his failure to catch the Ripper. The discovery that a man he had likely interviewed during the original manhunt was, in fact, a serial killer may have led him to see a pattern that wasn't truly there. So we are left with a chilling puzzle. Was George Chapman a criminal chameleon, a monster who so radically changed his methods that he essentially became two different serial killers in one lifetime? Or is the truth even more disturbing? Is it more likely that the dark, desperate labyrinth of Whitechapel in 1888 was a place so blighted, so consumed by misery and darkness, that it could have been home to two separate, monstrous serial killers, operating at the same time, their paths never crossing? The file on George Chapman remains a testament to a proven evil, but whether that evil wore the mask of the Ripper is a question that pits the gut feeling of a legendary detective against the fundamental logic of the criminal mind. The names of Druitt, Kosminski, and Chapman represent the most logical conclusions of a desperate police force, suspects born from circumstantial evidence and the private notes of the investigators. But the Jack the Ripper case was a mystery so profound, so utterly devoid of hard evidence, that it became a blank canvas for a century of theories, some plausible, some bizarre, and some born from the darkest corners of the public imagination. The gallery of phantoms extends far beyond the police files. One of the most enduring and sensational of these alternative suspects is a man who was, in his own right, a master of the London shadows, the celebrated artist Walter Sickert. A student of James Whistler, Sickert was famous for his dark, moody, and deeply atmospheric paintings of the London underclass. His work often depicted grim, claustrophobic domestic scenes with a palpable sense of menace. The theory, most aggressively pursued by the crime novelist Patricia Cornwell, suggests that Sickert was not just painting the darkness. He was living it. Proponents of the theory claim that his paintings contain hidden clues and confessions, and that his known misogyny and fascination with the grim realities of London life provided the psychological motive. Cornwell herself has spent millions of dollars on the theory, even claiming to have found DNA evidence on letters supposedly sent by both Sickert and the Ripper. However, the vast majority of Ripperologists and art historians remain unconvinced. The DNA evidence is highly controversial and scientifically disputed, and Sickert has a confirmed alibi for the weekend of the double event. He was in France. The more likely explanation is that Sickert was a brilliant artist obsessed with capturing the grim, violent reality of the world he lived in, not a secret monster confessing his crimes on canvas. Another intriguing figure is Dr. Robert Donston Stevenson, a journalist and physician with a deep and professed interest in black magic and the occult. Stevenson was in Whitechapel at the time, even staying at the London hospital. He possessed medical knowledge, was known to have a difficult relationship with women, and inserted himself into the investigation by writing letters to the press with his own theories, at one point accusing another doctor of being the killer, a move some see as a classic case of clever misdirection. But the case against Stevenson is built on a foundation of smoke. He was physically frail and likely incapable of the brutal acts of violence, and the theory relies more on his eccentric personality and esoteric interest than on any tangible evidence. Perhaps the most radical theory is that of Jill the Ripper. Could the killer have been a woman? Inspector Abberline himself reportedly considered the idea. The theory suggests that a woman, perhaps disguised as or working as a midwife, could have moved through the streets of Whitechapel at night without raising any suspicion. Blood on her clothes would not seem out of place. This could explain how the killer was able to approach the victims without a struggle and vanish so completely. The name most often connected to this theory is Mary Piercy, a woman who, in 1890, did murder her lover's wife and child in a shockingly brutal and frenzied knife attack. The savagery of her confirmed crime was so similar to the Ripper's that many, including Sir Arthur Conan Doyle, wondered if she could have been responsible for the Whitechapel murders as well. But again, with no direct evidence, Jill the Ripper remains a tantalizing but unprovable theory. These suspects, the artist, the occultist, the female killer, are just a few of the dozens of phantoms that populate the Ripper case files. Their enduring appeal speaks to the vacuum of proof at the heart of the mystery. But there was another element that cemented the killer's legendary status, a phenomenon that transformed a mere murderer into a taunting storybook monster, the Ripper letters. During the Autumn of Terror, Scotland Yard, news agencies, and the Whitechapel Vigilance Committee were inundated with hundreds upon hundreds of letters, all claiming to be from the killer. The vast majority of these were immediately dismissed as cruel hoaxes, the work of cranks, attention seekers, or drunkards. This flood of false information was a nightmare for the police, burying them in useless leads and forcing them to waste precious time chasing phantoms conjured by the public. But among this sea of forgeries, 3 documents became central to the Ripper legend. The first, and most important, was the Dear Boss letter, received by the Central News Agency on September the 27th. Written in red ink, it was a taunting, arrogant message, mocking the police for their incompetence. The author bragged about his work, calling it grand, and promised to clip the lady's ears off in his next job. Most critically, it was signed with the theatrical, instantly iconic name, Jack the Ripper. The press, against the wishes of the police, published the letter. The effect was instantaneous. The name Jack the Ripper was a spark in a tinderbox, a perfect, chilling moniker for the faceless terror. It was short, sharp, and menacing. The public seized upon it, and the Whitechapel murderer was instantly transformed into a legendary villain. A few days later, a postcard arrived, also addressed to the news agency. It referred to the double event that had just occurred and was signed Saucy Jackie. For decades, these letters were accepted as genuine communications from the killer. However, the vast majority of modern experts, and indeed many of the original investigators, came to believe that both the Dear Boss letter and the Saucy Jackie postcard were elaborate and cynical hoaxes, likely penned by a journalist from the Star newspaper in an effort to keep the story sensational and sell more papers. They were not the words of the killer, but the invention of a clever writer who inadvertently created the most famous name in the history of crime. There was, however, one communication that was almost certainly genuine. This was the From Hell letter, received by George Lusk of the Vigilance Committee. Its tone was completely different from the playful arrogance of Dear Boss. It was semi-literate, grim, and bore no signature, and it came with its gruesome trophy, half of a human kidney, preserved in alcohol. The writer claimed to have fried and ate the other half. This letter, with its physical proof, is widely believed to be the one and only true message from the killer. Its words, from hell, are not the boast of a theatrical villain, but the simple, terrifying dateline from the heart of the monster's world. And so the gallery of phantoms is complete. A handful of plausible but unprovable suspects, a rogues gallery of eccentric theorists, and a blizzard of letters, most of them fake, that gave the killer his immortal name. The desperate hunt had yielded no answers, only more questions, more shadows, more ghosts. The absence of evidence had created a void, and into that void, the world had projected its darkest fears and fantasies, creating a myth that would prove to be more powerful and more enduring than the man himself. In the cold November days that followed the discovery in Miller's Court, a terrified London braced for the next attack. The city waited, its nerves frayed, its eyes fixed on the dark alleys of the East End, certain that the monster, having reached such a horrifying crescendo, would surely strike again. But the next blow never fell. The days bled into weeks, the weeks into months, and the months into years. The autumn of terror gave way to a winter of uneasy quiet, and then to a spring of fragile relief. Jack the Ripper was gone. The greatest mystery of the case is not who the killer was, but why he stopped. A force of such savage, seemingly uncontrollable violence does not simply cease to exist. Something must have happened. Over the century that followed, investigators, historians, and amateur detectives have returned again and again to this central question, producing 4 main theories, each one a potential solution to the phantom's sudden disappearance. The first, and perhaps most widely accepted, theory is that the killer died. This is the simplest and neatest solution. A compulsive, homicidal mania like the Ripper's is not a thing one simply grows out of. It is a fire that burns until it is extinguished. The most definitive way to stop a serial killer is for the killer himself to be stopped permanently. This theory aligns perfectly with the case of our first suspect, Montague John Druitt. His disappearance at the end of November and suicide in December of 1888 provides a powerful, if circumstantial, explanation for the end of the murders. The timeline is a near-perfect match, but the killer could have died in other ways. In the violent, disease-ridden world of Whitechapel, life was cheap and death was commonplace. He could have succumbed to one of the many diseases, like syphilis or tuberculosis, that were rampant in the slums. He could have been the victim of a drunken brawl, his body dumped unceremoniously into the Thames. In a district where thousands lived and died without official record, it is entirely plausible that the Ripper's death went completely unnoticed, his secret buried with him in an unmarked pauper's grave. The theory is compelling in its finality. The storm did not pass. The storm itself was destroyed. The second major theory is that the killer was not dead, but caged. This is the argument for incarceration or institutionalization. This too aligns perfectly with one of our prime suspects, Aaron Kosminski. The private notes of Chief Constable Swanson tell the story of a man identified by a witness but never prosecuted, who was instead taken in hand by his family and confined to a lunatic asylum in early 1889, where he remained for the rest of his life. In this scenario, the murders stopped because the madman was finally removed from the streets, his violent compulsions contained within the high walls of an institution. This theory is not limited to Kosminski. The Ripper could have been arrested for a different, lesser crime, a theft, a robbery, a common assault, and been sentenced to a long term of penal servitude. The police, having no way to link this petty criminal to the great murderer, would have had no reason to suspect they had their man. His file would be just one among thousands in the prison system. Modern researchers have spent countless hours poring over the asylum and prison records of the era, searching for a perfect candidate whose incarceration aligns with the end of the killings. While several intriguing possibilities have been found, no definitive match has ever been made. A third, more prosaic theory is that the killer simply moved away. Whitechapel was a transient place, a first stop for immigrants, and a last resort for the desperate. The killer could have been a sailor who shipped out on a long voyage, or an immigrant who, having failed to make his fortune in London, moved on to America or elsewhere in the world. This could explain the handful of Ripper-like murders that were reported in other countries in the years that followed. This theory is plausible in its simplicity, but it is deeply unsatisfying. It requires us to believe that a killer driven by such a powerful ritualistic urge could simply pack his bags and contain his compulsions, at least for a time. It leaves the phantom at large, a ghost free to haunt another city, another dark corner of the world. But it is the fourth theory that is, perhaps, the most chilling of all. The theory that the killer was not stopped by death or by prison, but that he stopped for his own reasons, that he simply chose to stop. This suggests a mind that was not a slave to its madness, but a master of it. In this view, the Ripper was in control all along. Why might he have chosen to stop? Perhaps he had a close call during the murder of Mary Jane Kelly. The indoor crime scene was audacious, but it was also incredibly risky. Perhaps he was nearly discovered, a moment of terror that was enough to frighten him into quitting while he was ahead. Or perhaps the opposite is true. Perhaps the utter annihilation of Mary Kelly was his masterpiece, the final, perfect expression of his violent fantasy. He had achieved his terrible goal, and the compulsion was, for a time, satisfied. There was nothing more he needed to do. Alternatively, his personal circumstances may have changed. A life event, a marriage, a new job, a move away from the city could have altered his routine and made his nocturnal hunts impossible. Or perhaps he was taken in by a family member who became aware of his dark nature and managed to contain him. This theory, that the killer simply stopped, is the most disturbing because it means that Jack the Ripper won. He terrorized a city, committed a series of monstrous acts, and then, when he was done, he simply faded back into the fabric of society. He lived out the rest of his life, a seemingly normal man, a quiet neighbor, a husband, a father, a colleague. He would have passed you on the street, his eyes holding the memory of what he had done, his hands the memory of the lives they had taken. In this scenario, the ghost never left. He simply put on a new mask, the mask of ordinary life, and wore it until he died. Each of these theories is plausible, and each has its own compelling candidate. Death points to Druid. Incarceration points to Kosminski. But in the end, they are all just stories, attempts to impose a logical ending onto a narrative that has none. The silence of Jack the Ripper is as fundamental to his mystery as his violence. It is a blank page at the end of a terrifying book, a void into which we can only project our own fears and theories, forever wondering at the fate of the man who brought terror to a city, and then was gone. The silence of Jack the Ripper did not bring peace to the East End. It left behind a scar, a collective trauma etched into the memory of the city. For years afterwards, any unsolved murder of a woman was attributed to him, his ghost invoked with every new act of violence. He became the ultimate bogeyman, a cautionary tale whispered in the dark, his name entering the English language as a byword for a monstrous, unknowable evil that could lurk beneath the most civilized of surfaces. But the Ripper's true legacy was not just one of fear. The 5 weeks of the Autumn of Terror were a seismic event, a shock to the system of the British Empire that exposed the deep, rotten foundations upon which its grand society was built. The consequences of the killer's brief, bloody reign would be profound, forcing a painful modernization of the very institutions that had failed to stop him. The first and most immediate institution to be shattered was the police force itself. The hunt for the Ripper was the most public and humiliating failure in the history of Scotland Yard. The force, which had been a source of national pride, was exposed as an archaic and ill-equipped organization, powerless to protect its citizens from a single, determined predator. The press and the public were merciless in their criticism, depicting the London peeler not as a capable guardian, but as a bumbling fool, always one step behind the killer. This failure had consequences. The embattled commissioner of the Metropolitan Police, Sir Charles Warren, was forced to resign in the direct aftermath of the Mary Kelly murder, a public scapegoat for the department's inability to stop the carnage. But from this humiliation came a forced and necessary evolution. The Ripper case laid bare the desperate need for a more scientific approach to crime fighting. It highlighted the critical importance of preserving evidence at a crime scene and the severe limitations of relying solely on witness testimony. In the years that followed, the very techniques that might have caught the Ripper began to be formally adopted. The new science of fingerprinting, which had been ignored, was slowly integrated into police work. Advances were made in crime scene photography and the documentation of evidence. The case was a brutal lesson, paid for in blood, that forced the police to begin their long, slow march into the modern age of forensic investigation. The Ripper's second great legacy was in the world of the media. The murders of 1888 coincided with the rise of cheap, mass-market newspapers and a newly literate working class, hungry for sensational stories. The Whitechapel murders were the perfect fuel for this fire. The press did not just report on the Ripper. In many ways, they invented him. The Dear Boss letter, almost certainly a journalistic hoax, gave the killer his immortal name and his taunting, theatrical persona. The penny dreadfuls and illustrated papers competed to publish the most gruesome details and the most lurid, speculative drawings of the crimes. This was the birth of modern tabloid journalism as we know it. The Ripper was the first media superstar serial killer, a terrifying celebrity whose story sold millions of papers. The case created the template for all future true crime coverage. The obsessive focus on the killer's psychology, the creation of a folk devil persona, the public's morbid fascination with the gruesome details, and the rise of the amateur sleuth. The global obsession with true crime that exists today can trace its lineage directly back to the gaslit, ink-stained press rooms of 1888. But the most significant and ironic legacy of Jack the Ripper was one of social reform. Before the murders, the plight of London's East End was a matter of comfortable indifference to the wealthy citizens and politicians of the West End. Whitechapel was another world, a place to be ignored, a dark stain on the city's reputation that was best left hidden. The Ripper changed that. His knife, in its terrible work, cut through the veil of ignorance. The sensational media coverage, while often exploitative, forced the entire world to look, truly look, at the horrific conditions in which the victims and hundreds of thousands like them lived. Reporters were sent not just to cover the murders, but to describe the squalor of the lodging houses, the desperation of the poor, and the complete failure of the state to provide a basic safety net for its most vulnerable citizens. Social reformers and writers, like the great George Bernard Shaw, seized the moment. They used the Ripper case as a powerful and unignorable argument, writing scathing articles that blamed not just the killer, but society itself for the crimes. They argued that the true monster was the crushing poverty that created a class of women so desperate that they had no choice but to place their lives in the hands of strangers, night after night. The public outcry was so great that it could no longer be ignored. The murders became a catalyst for change, spurring on a movement that led to the clearing of some of the worst slums, the reform of the lodging houses, and a new public awareness of the deep social rot at the heart of the empire. It is the greatest paradox of the case. The most infamous serial killer in history, a man who was the very embodiment of violence and misogyny, inadvertently became one of the most effective catalysts for social reform and the improvement of women's lives in the East End. In his quest to destroy, the Phantom of Whitechapel forced a city to rebuild. He was a monster who, through his monstrous acts, forced a complacent society to finally confront the real demons that lurked, not in the shadows of its alleyways, but in the indifference of its own heart. The case of Jack the Ripper eventually went cold, relegated to the dusty archives of Scotland Yard. The press moved on, the public's memory faded, and the City of London healed over its deepest scar. But for one man, the case never ended. The Autumn of Terror was not a historical event. It was a room in his mind that he could never truly leave. For Chief Inspector Frederick Abberline, the hunt for the Ripper became a lifelong obsession. Abberline continued his distinguished career at Scotland Yard for a few more years, eventually rising to become the Chief Inspector of the Criminal Investigation Department. He was, by all accounts, one of the most respected and capable detectives of his generation. But the shadow of the Whitechapel murders followed him. The case was his great, unsolved masterpiece, a monument to the limits of logic in the face of pure, inhuman chaos. In 1892, just 4 years after the Autumn of Terror, he retired from the police force, but he never truly retired from the case. In his quiet retirement, Abberline became the unofficial custodian of the Ripper mystery. He was the living link to that terrible time, and journalists, authors, and younger detectives would often seek him out, hoping for some secret insight, some forgotten clue that he held locked away. He would speak of the case with a grim authority, his memory of the dark, foggy streets and the horrific crime scenes still sharp and clear. He was a man haunted by the ghost he had been sent to catch, a ghost that had outsmarted him, outmaneuvered him, and then vanished, leaving him with a legacy of failure. His obsession was not passive. Years later, when the serial poisoner George Chapman was arrested, Abberline, then working as a private detective, was brought back into the orbit of his old nemesis. It was he who interviewed Chapman's estranged wife, gathering the evidence that would help send him to the gallows. And it was Abberline who, upon Chapman's conviction, reportedly declared with a weary certainty, "You've got Jack the Ripper at last." This statement reveals the profound weight the case still held for him. In the cold, calculating cruelty of George Chapman, Abberline found the most satisfying answer to the puzzle that had tormented him. Chapman was a proven monster with the right skills and the right location. For Abberline, a man whose entire life had been dedicated to finding order in chaos, this was the most logical solution. To believe that Chapman was the Ripper was to finally put a face to the phantom, to give a name to the source of his greatest professional failure. It was, perhaps, a way to finally quiet the ghosts. But the certainty he projected likely masked a deeper, more profound unknowing. The Ripper case was an affront to his entire being. He was a detective who believed in facts, in evidence, in the methodical process of deduction, and he had been defeated by a killer who left behind nothing but butchered bodies and terrifying questions. The case represented the triumph of chaos over order, of madness over reason. Frederick Abberline lived to be an old man, dying in 1929 at the age of 86. He carried the secrets of the Autumn of Terror to his grave, his files and his theories becoming a cornerstone of the legend he helped to create. But in the end, he was, in a way, the Ripper's final uncounted victim. The killer had taken the lives of 5 women, had terrorized a city, and had created a legend. But he had also taken a piece of Frederick Abberline's soul, leaving a wound that would never fully heal. The great detective spent the last 40 years of his life haunted by the one case he could not solve, forever walking the dark, gaslit corridors of his own memory, forever hunting the ghost that got away. The police files on the Whitechapel murders were eventually closed. The thousands of pages of testimony, reports, and frantic letters bound in twine and consigned to the dusty archives of Scotland Yard. The hunt was over, but the story was not. In the absence of a solution, in the profound and deafening silence left by the killer, the world began to write its own endings. The man of flesh and blood, whoever he was, faded from history, and in his place, a myth was born. Jack the Ripper ceased to be a criminal. He became a ghost, a permanent resident in the darkest corners of our collective imagination, a story to be told and retold around the dying embers of a fire. Throughout this journey, we have walked the gaslit, fog-shrouded streets of his world. We have stood in the oppressive darkness of the labyrinth that was Whitechapel, a place so perfectly designed for violence that it seemed to be a willing accomplice to the crimes. We saw how the city itself, its maze-like alleys, its crushing poverty, and its culture of anonymity, was not just a setting, but an antagonist, a force that both created the conditions for the killer and then swallowed him whole, keeping his secrets. We have stood witness to the final, desperate hours of the victims, Polly, Annie, Elizabeth, Catherine, and Mary Jane. We must remember them not as a canonical list, but as women, daughters, wives, and mothers, whose lives, already fractured by hardship, were extinguished with a brutality that still shocks the conscience. They are the true human heart of this tragedy, a testament to a society that had cast them into the shadows, leaving them vulnerable to the predator who hunted there. Their stories are a grim reminder that the most horrific of tales are not works of fiction, but are etched into the history of real human suffering. We have opened the cold case files on the phantom suspects. Montague Druitt, the gentleman whose conveniently timed suicide offered a neat and tidy end to the horror. Aaron Kosminski, the tragic madman from the heart of the Labyrinth, who was condemned by the private notes of the very men who hunted him. George Chapman, the proven monster, a cold-blooded serial killer who may have worn two different masks of death. Each is a compelling story, a plausible solution. But they remain just that, stories. Characters in a drama we have constructed to fill the void, to give a face to a faceless terror. And we have followed the great detective, Frederick Abberline, a man of logic and reason, on his descent into an irrational nightmare. His desperate hunt revealed the limits of his world, the failure of his institutions, and the impotence of order in the face of true chaos. His story is a quiet tragedy, a lifelong obsession with a ghost he could never lay to rest. So who was Jack the Ripper? After more than a century of searching, we are no closer to an answer, but perhaps that has always been the wrong question. Perhaps the real question is not who he was, but what he was. Jack the Ripper was not a demon who crept into a perfect world. He was a grimly natural product of his time and place. He was the logical endpoint of an era that preached public morality while allowing a dark underbelly of unimaginable squalor and desperation to fester just beneath the surface. He was the monster that crawled out of the Victorian subconscious, a terrifying manifestation of the violence, the poverty, and the profound indifference that defined his world. The City of London was not just his hunting ground, it was his creator. The Ripper did not create the darkness in Whitechapel, the darkness created him. In the end, the most enduring legacy of the case is its lack of a conclusion. And that is perhaps why the story has never faded. A solved crime becomes a fact, a historical footnote, a simple entry in a textbook. But an unsolved mystery becomes a myth. It retains its power because it leaves a space for our own fears, our own theories, our own morbid curiosity. The case of Jack the Ripper is not a story about an answer. It is a story about the terrifying, magnetic power of a question mark. It is a dark mirror, and in its reflection, we see the unsettling truth that not all stories have an ending, that not all monsters are caught, and that some ghosts are never laid to rest. History, as we know it, is a landscape of recorded events, of dates and names and battles won and lost. But surrounding this small, illuminated landscape is a vast and dark wilderness of the unknown, of the forgotten, the unrecorded, and the deliberately silenced. We spend our time searching for monsters in the past, sifting through the archives for their names and their motives. But sometimes, the most haunting spectre of all is not the monster we find, but the silence he leaves behind. Thank you for joining me on this deep dive into the labyrinth of the Jack the Ripper case. If you believe these complex stories from our past are important and must be remembered, you can help us continue this work by liking this video. And to ensure you don't miss our next investigation into the hidden corners of history, please consider subscribing to the channel. I'm always curious to hear your thoughts. Based on the evidence we've explored, who do you believe is the most likely suspect? Let me know in the comments below. Until next time, stay curious.